Highway 375, Nevada, early March 2007, found our convoy rolling north across a desert so wide it felt like the world had been scraped flat and left unfinished. And I remember thinking that nothing out here wanted to be known or questioned, not the dirt, not the horizon, not silence that pressed against the windows with a kind of patient weight and back. Then I was Lieutenant Callahan Veyron working combat logistics during a fort. When rotation with sand in every fold of my uniform and a dull, angry pulse behind my right eye that had been there for days and refused break in our convoy was simple enough: 12 soldiers, 4 HMMWVs, spare trailers, and a pile of supply gear headed toward a quiet operations site near Rachel, following a route that looked clean on the map except for a checkpoint none of us had heard of until we saw it printed in faint blue like someone had added it at the last possible moment yet expected us not to notice. And we called this strip the Extraterrestrial Highway, a name that felt more like a warning than a tourist joke, with dead-looking brush scattered across cracked earth and mountains in the distance that seemed to retreat. The closer you drove, and every so often a billboard with cartoon aliens would grin at passing cars like even the land wanted to laugh at you. And sitting beside me was Sergeant Thier Montreux, a man with a gravel voice and eyes that measured every mile with suspicion and calculation. A veteran who chewed toothpicks to keep himself from tearing back into tobacco after his wife insisted he quit. And he stared at the map like it owed him answers and kept muttering about spacing and mileage, while Corporal Amoris Langdon drove with that pale, steady Vermont calm, clicking his tongue whenever he concentrated, much to Montreux's constant annoyance, though secretly I found the sound grounding in a way I could not explain. And in vehicle, two behind us, was Private Silas Penrose, still nearly a kid with the eager energy of someone who had not yet been told by the world what it would take from him. He kept asking cheerful questions about the sky and the silence and whether aliens watched us from behind the mountain ridges. And the kind of innocence he carried is the kind that sticks with you in the wrong way long after everything goes dark. And we had pulled out of Nellie's before sunrise. Desert still cold enough to bite through gloves, and the route laid out for us with 3 checkpoints marked in blue Alpha Bravo, and one labeled Rachel checkpoint, positioned 20 miles north of Bravo, though none of us recognized the name, and I remember thinking it was odd, but not odd enough to worry about because plenty of strange things get printed on maps in the military. And by the time the sun burned through the horizon, we were already hours into the trip, rolling in formation with 50 meters between vehicles and a steady rhythm of radio checks bouncing from one truck to the next. The world stretched out empty in every direction, and when we arrived at Alpha Checkpoint, the private on duty punched our cards, made the same tired joke about conspiracy theories that I had heard 100 times, and waved us through, and before long the heat was pushing up through the metal of floorboards, turning the interior of the HMMWV into a slow roasting box that filled the air with the smell of sweat canvas and warm plastic. And Montreux muttered about the new checkpoint on the map, tapping it with the chewed end of his toothpick, and telling me that Rachel checkpoint had not existed on any previous route through this sector. And I shrugged it off and told him that stations come and go and that supply chains always shift. But I noted the tension in his jaw and the way he kept flipping the map and rechecking the print date, like he expected the page to correct itself if he stared hard enough. And when we hit Bravo, the soldier posted there repeated the same thing. The station was newly established last week and manned by someone named Kowalski. And to tell him, Rodriguez said hello, and we all laughed politely, even though the exchange felt too rehearsed, like a script read too many times by people who did not believe their own lines. And as we pushed farther north, the desert grew flatter and colder in spirit, even as the heat climbed, and I began to feel as though the air itself was waiting for something. And Montreux finally said something that made the hair on my arms lift. He told me the map felt too new, smelled too new, like the ink had not finished drying. And when I checked it myself, I caught the faintest scent of fresh print, a sharp chemical smell that should not have been there. And I told myself I imagined it, but I knew I had not. And as we neared the mileage where Rachel checkpoint was supposed to appear, the tension in the cab grew thick, and Langdon slowed the vehicle, scanning the road for any sign of life. Yet nothing appeared, no structure, no flag, no post, not even disturbed soil to suggest that anything man-made had ever been placed there. And we rolled past the exact coordinates with nothing but shimmering heat and dead silence staring back at us, until I finally ordered the convoy to halt and stepped out into the burning daylight, feeling the heat hammer down on my skull, while Penrose approached with that earnest concern of his, asking if we needed someone to scout the area, and I told him to hold position while I radioed Nellie's and asked for confirmation on the existence of the checkpoint, reading off the coordinates one careful number at a time, and waiting with the kind of tight breath you only feel when deep down you already know the answer. Will not make sense, and that was the moment when the desert first felt wrong, the moment when everything we knew about maps and routes and reality began to loosen just a little, as if the world itself had quietly shifted while we were not looking. The radio answered with a long hiss that felt alive in the heat, and for a moment I wondered if anything human would speak through it at all, before a clipped voice finally rose through the static, ordering our convoy to stand by, and those words hung in the scorching air while Montreux paced in a tight circle, studying the dirt as though it might confess something if he stared hard enough, and Langdon leaned out of the window with his face pinched tight, asking if maybe the checkpoint had been moved, but Montreux shut that thought down fast, saying checkpoints do not wander and are never relocated. Without full documentation, and before he could continue, the radio crackled again, and Nellie's reported with cold certainty that no record existed for any Rachel checkpoint within our area of operation, and they ordered us to confirm our position and proceed as planned, and my hand tightened on the mic. As I explained that our map issued only hours earlier clearly showed a blue marker for that checkpoint exactly 20 miles north of Bravo, and I asked for clarification, yet the silence stretched long enough to feel like someone on the other end was debating how much truth they were allowed to say, before the voice returned, stating without hesitation that no such station had ever been authorized or placed in our sector, and that we were to continue to our destination and acknowledge the order. And I lowered the mic slowly because something in the tone from base felt wrong, like they were not confused but nervous, and that realization settled into my bones like cold water dripping down the spine, and Penrose shifted from foot to foot, asking what that meant, and I told him it meant the checkpoint was not real, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they did not feel honest, and Montreux folded the map with a certain care as though the paper might crumble between his fingers, and he reminded me that maps are vetted through several layers of review before issue, and that someone had to place that marker deliberately and print it and sign off on it, which made the error too deliberate for comfort. But I gave the order to move because the desert felt like it was listening, and silence can become pressure if you stand still too long. And as we rolled back onto the road, the map lay on Montreux's lap, glowing faintly in the hard light, and I kept glancing at it despite myself, especially at the blue dot that looked darker than all the others, like an ink drop that had refused to fade. And when I touched it, the faint scent of fresh print rose again, sharp and chemical and out of place, and I showed it to Montreux, and he smelled it too, and his brow furrowed as he whispered that maps do not smell like this, not even new ones. And the road stretched ahead, empty as a drained river, and the radios fell silent, as though the airwaves themselves wanted no part in what we were driving toward. And the town of Rachel appeared on a faded sign telling us we were 15 miles out, and the thought wormed through my mind that this was the same region built on legend and government secrecy, a place where strange stories clung to the desert like dust. And I asked Montreux if we should stop and ask locals about the checkpoint, and he suggested 5 minutes would not ruin the mission, so I agreed, even though orders did not mention civilian stops. But something about this felt like it needed digging, and the town greeted us with its familiar oddity murals of green figures painted on buildings and souvenir shops that sold mystery as currency, and the little inn sat like a small oasis under the relentless sun. So I parked and told the rest to stay with the vehicles while Montreux and I stepped inside into cool dim light that smelled faintly of old carpet and frying oil, and alien decorations crowded the walls like an eccentric museum curated by belief rather than fact. And the woman behind the counter smiled with practiced warmth and asked how she could help, and when we mentioned Rachel checkpoint, something in her eyes tightened, though her smile stayed fixed, and she wiped the counter in slow circles, saying the military did not tell townsfolk things and we should ask the sheriff's office instead. And as we left, the old man on the porch watched us with eyes that looked like weathered stone, and when I asked him directly, he said in a steady voice that no checkpoint had ever existed south of town, not now, not 40 years ago. And the way he said it with such certainty twisted something in my gut, and he told us we were asking the wrong questions and turned away as if the conversation had ended long before we stepped outside. And we returned to the vehicles with nothing but more questions and rolled out of town. But I kept glancing in the rear mirror, watching the old man lift his hand in a half gesture that could have been warning or farewell, And as we drove south again, the blue marker on the map felt heavier in my mind, like a weight pulling thought after thought into darker water. And on the way back, I asked each checkpoint if they had heard of Rachel, but each guard gave the same puzzled answer, and one even asked if I had mistaken my route. And when we passed once more the exact stretch of highway where the checkpoint had been marked, the interior of the HMMWV shuddered with a burst of cold air sharp enough to sting the lungs, and Langdon flinched and looked at me with wide eyes before I ordered him to keep focus on the road, and Montreux stared straight ahead with a stillness that made the air feel tighter, and the sun soon died behind the mountains, pulling night down fast, and the stars came alive brighter than city lights will ever allow, and as the darkness wrapped around the convoy, the empty highway seemed to stretch out forever like a tunnel carved through nothing, yet something unseen pressed at the edges of my awareness like fingers testing the fabric of the world. And by the time we reached Nellie's at 2200 hours, I felt as though the desert had not simply let us pass, but had watched us the entire time. And when we filed reports and handed off gear, I found I could not bring myself to mention the cold or the missing checkpoint or the smell of ink, because something told me speaking it aloud would make it real in a way I was not ready to face. And as I tried to sleep that night, every time I shut my eyes, I saw nothing but that vacant patch of highway, a place that officially did not exist yet on our map, had been marked clearly by a hand no one could explain. The soldier at Bravo had shrugged and told me that maps sometimes printed wrong, and those words kept echoing in my mind as we pushed south, because when we reached the exact mileage where Rachel checkpoint should have appeared, the HMMWV filled with a sudden burst of cold air so sharp it felt like the desert had inhaled and breathed winter straight into our lungs, and I saw Langdon glance sideways at me with a look that begged for an explanation I did not have, and I told him to keep his eyes forward even though my own pulse had started thudding in my throat, and Montreux sat rigid with the map clutched in his lap, staring at the windshield like he expected something to materialize out of the dark, and the sun dropped behind the mountains in a final bleed of amber that quickly surrendered to purple and then black until the sky was a ceiling of scattered fire, and Langdon switched on headlights, and the world narrowed to two beams cutting through emptiness, and the desert felt watchful again, as though the land itself had leaned closer to hear us breathe. And I kept replaying every detail of the day in my head, the missing checkpoint, the smell of ink, the voice on the radio saying no such station exists, and I wondered what kind of mistake leaves a cold gust lingering in a sealed vehicle out on an empty highway. But no matter how I framed it, nothing made sense, and the silence in the cab became heavier until Montreux quietly folded the map and slipped it into his breast pocket, saying he intended to keep it because evidence matters when no one believes what you saw, and I did not argue because something in his tone made me feel like we were already part of a story that wanted to forget us. And as we drove, the radio broke the quiet with status checks and spacing confirmations, all routine, all normal, yet the routine itself felt thin like paper stretched over something much larger, and I stared ahead pretending not to feel the pressure coiling in my chest. But the truth was simple: a missing checkpoint is one thing, a wrong entry on a map is one thing, but cold air appearing from nowhere is something else entirely, and whether I admitted it or not, part of me already knew that we had brushed against something we were not supposed to find. And when we finally returned to Nellie's at 2200 hours, the base lights looked softer, somehow almost distant. And we went through end-of-mission procedures like sleepwalkers, handing over logs and keys and equipment, while duty officers glanced up briefly before moving on, because to them, this was just another convoy returning on time and intact. And when the officer asked if we had any issues, I hesitated and felt Montreux watching me, and I said, "No, sir, everything normal." And the moment the words left my lips, I felt a small twist of guilt, because nothing about the day had been normal, yet saying so out loud felt like stepping through a door I was not ready to enter. And after that, we walked out into a base that hummed with engines and voices and familiar lights, but none of it settled the unease. And as soon as we reached the shadows outside the motor pool, Montreux pulled the map from his pocket and held it under a street lamp, and the blue marker for Rachel checkpoint seemed darker than before, almost glossy, like it refused to age with the paper around it. And he whispered that he intended to ask Supply who had issued it, but he doubted anyone would tell him. And we split up, and I returned to my quarters, where the shower did nothing to shake the desert dust from my thoughts. And when I laid in my bunk with my eyes closed, all I could see was that stretch of road where nothing stood, but the air had turned cold, as though something unseen had brushed past us, testing the edges of our presence and mourning. arrived too early, dragging me from shallow sleep, and I dressed and stepped into air that felt cleaner than the night before, but not enough to erase the weight in my chest. And when I reached my office, Montreux was waiting outside, looking like a man who had stayed awake with questions instead of rest. And he held the map in both hands as if it might start speaking, and he followed me inside and told me he had visited supply at 400 hours and cornered the night shift attendant to ask about map distribution. And the man had explained that every map gets printed at base print facilities 2 weeks prior to issue using digital files approved by cartography and signed out the morning of the mission by designated handlers, and ours had been signed by Corporal Hendris at 0545, which should have been normal, yet none of that explained the phantom checkpoint. So Montreux pushed further and tracked down the specialist in cartography who kept the digital archive and woke it from a deep sleep and demanded to see the original route file. And the specialist pulled it up and searched every layer, every notation, every grid, and found no trace of any Rachel checkpoint in any recorded version. And that already felt bad enough, but then the specialist inspected our physical map and pointed out that the blue of the Rachel marker did not match the shade used for Alpha and Bravo, and that the pigment seemed too fresh, almost hand-added after printing. And he attempted to scan the map for documentation, but each attempt glitched and returned corrupted files, and Montreux watched it try again and again until the specialist finally said he would escalate it to a supervisor because he had never seen a physical map reject scanning like that. And as he told me all this, he placed the map on my desk, and I smelled that faint chemical ink scent again, like it had been printed yesterday, not 2 weeks ago. And I had no words because every part of his story felt like steps on a path we had already started walking without understanding the destination. And before I could process it, Langdon appeared at the door holding printouts, and he looked pale, almost concerned that he had crossed a line by digging, but he stepped inside and said he had researched missing incidents along Highway 375 and found an article from 1989 detailing a convoy that had vanished on the same route, same month, same number of vehicles, and 12 soldiers gone without trace. And when I read the article, my pulse sharpened, and Langdon laid down 2 more reports from 1995 and 2001, and both described convoys nearly identical to ours that disappeared near the same stretch of highway south of Rachel. And as the pages lay across my desk with their faded words and lost names, the room felt smaller, and I realized the desert had been keeping score for decades, and something in that empty place had taken convoys before, and 3 groups of 12 meant 36 soldiers erased from the world, and every detail overlapped except one. We had come back, and I found no comfort in that because patterns do not break, they bend and reshape and return. And I stared at those printouts and whispered, almost without thinking, that maybe we had not escaped anything, maybe we had simply been noticed. The weight of those 3 articles settled over the room like a storm cloud, thick and unmoving, and as Montreux read the dates out loud, 1989, 1995, 2001, all in March, all near Rachel, each describing 12 soldiers vanishing without a fight, without wreckage, without a single footprint leading away from the abandoned vehicles. A cold understanding tightened inside me that this was not coincidence, not misprint, not rumor, but pattern, and the blue marker on our map no longer felt like error but intention. And while the silence stretched between us, something darkened in the air, like the office itself was listening for what we would do next. And before any of us could speak, the door opened without warning, and Major Talbot stepped inside, crisp uniform, stern face, every inch him radiating authority. Though his eyes flicked to the maps and printouts with a flash of concern he tried to hide, and he ordered us to report to his office in 10 minutes and left just as quickly. And the moment the door closed behind him, Langdon whispered that this could not be good, and I dismissed him with orders not to speak of anything he had seen. And once he was gone, Montreux tucked the contaminated map beneath his arm, and we walked toward the admin building, feeling more exposed with every step. And the base around us hummed with the usual noise, engines being tested, boots hitting pavement, voices drifting through open doors, yet none of it reached us clearly, as if a thin film had dropped over the world, muting everything except the pounding question of what exactly we had brought back from that desert route. And when we entered Talbot's office, he was seated behind his desk, hands folded, jaw tight, and he motioned for us to sit without ceremony, and he began speaking. Before we could ask a single thing, saying Specialist Garrett had contacted him about an unauthorized checkpoint marked on our issued map, and that we had been questioning personnel about it and demanded an explanation, so I told him everything piece by piece: the missing checkpoint, the denials from Nelly's, the fresh ink smell, the scanner glitch, the cold air that blasted through our vehicle, and Montreux, filled in details until the full story lay between us like an open wound, and Talbot remained still for a long moment before opening a desk drawer and pulling out a folder aged and yellow around the edges, and he laid 3 maps across the table, each from the convoys that vanished in 1989, 1995, and 2001. And every map bore the same blue marker, Rachel checkpoint, same coordinates, same shade of ink that looked too new for paper so old. And he told us that every time the marker had appeared, the convoy assigned to that map never returned from Highway 375, and the official explanations, training accidents classified for privacy, were just the cover stories because no evidence had ever been found, nothing damaged, nothing stolen, nothing human left behind. And I felt my throat tighten as he said the words, because it confirmed what I had already felt in my bones, that we had stepped into something older and stranger than desert legend, and worse. He said we were the first marked convoy to come back, which meant either the pattern had broken or something new was unfolding, and the uncertainty in his face told me he feared the latter, and he admitted they had investigated every missing group and never found any military or civilian suspect, and that each map had gone through the same process without anyone knowing who added the checkpoint. But he insisted shutting down Highway 375 was impossible because of its strategic necessity, and that commanders were instructed simply to be aware but never speak of the incidents. And I asked him why we had not been warned, and he told us because warning us would not have changed what happened and might only have drawn more attention to a threat no one understood. And though I wanted to shout at him, I saw the exhaustion behind his eyes and realized he had fought this battle long before we stumbled into it. And he took our map, placed it in an evidence bag, and informed us we were reassigned away from Highway 375 indefinitely, and that we were forbidden from discussing any portion of the incident, the checkpoint, the histories, the cold air, the map, nothing. And he framed it as protection, but I heard the fear under the words, like he believed silence could save us because knowledge had not saved the others. And once we stepped outside, Montreux exhaled hard, saying Talbot was scared, and I agreed because I had seen officers under fire, seen men rattled by trauma. But this was different. This was a man commanding a base, yet looking over his shoulder at shadows he could not track. And as we walked across the base, the sun rose higher, turning everything bright and harmless to any outsider, but not to us, because beneath the routine of drills and engines, I felt the awareness of our presence, like something unseen was following just out of sight. And Montreux finally asked if I remembered the burst of cold air at the coordinates, and I said yes, even though the memory had already begun digging itself deeper into me. And he asked what I thought it was, and I had no answer because naming it felt like stepping closer to it, and we were not ready for that. Unease kept building inside me because all of this, these maps, the disappearances, the denials from Nelly's, the blue marker that refused to age, pointed towards something deliberate and watching, something that had been pulling convoys off the grid for decades and had reached for us too, but somehow miscalculated or paused or waited, and I could not tell which possibility frightened me more. And as the morning heat thickened around us, I realized with chilling certainty that the story was not over. In fact, it had barely begun, because 36 soldiers had vanished, and the thing responsible was not finished yet. And no matter how hard we tried to pretend otherwise, we had already been marked. And whatever had noticed us was still out there waiting in that empty place on the map where nothing should exist, but something definitely did. The question sat heavy between us as we walked the length of the base, and I felt the Nevada sun on my face, but none of its warmth reached me because all I could think about was the cold blast that had hit us on that stretch of highway, and the way it seemed to come from nowhere and yet felt intentional, like the exhale of something standing too close and listening. And before I could sort through that memory, Montreux stopped walking and told me there was something he had kept to himself, something he had tried to dismiss but could not. And when I asked what he meant, he said that when cold air hit us, he had glanced into the side mirror and seen a figure standing in the road behind the convoy, a tall shape, too still to be human. And though it vanished when he turned his head, he knew he had seen it plainly for a full second, and the admission sent a chill through me deeper than cold wind had. And I asked him why he had not spoken sooner, and he said because he thought it was a trick of light until the dream of that figure refused to leave him the night before. And as he spoke, the world around us felt too open, too bright, too exposed, and I told him to ask the others because whatever he saw might not have been his imagination. And when we reached the motor pool, I found Langdon beneath the hood of an HMMWV. And when we asked him if he had seen anything strange near the missing checkpoint, he hesitated before saying he had seen someone in the rear view just for a heartbeat. Tall and unmoving in the center of the cracked asphalt. And when he blinked, it was gone, and he had convinced himself he imagined it because the alternative felt impossible and Montreux, and I exchanged a look of quiet dread because that made two of us who had seen the same impossible thing, and we went next to the barracks where Penrose sat cleaning his rifle, humming a tune that faltered when he saw our faces. And when we questioned him, he frowned and said he had seen someone too far off in the dirt, just standing and watching, and thought it had been a signpost, but something about its height had stuck with him and he had tried to push it out of his mind but could not. And when we left him, his hands were shaking and he no longer hummed, and outside the barracks Montreux lit a cigarette, breaking his 3-month streak without one because his hands needed something to hold, and he said 4 sightings meant no coincidence, meant no illusion, meant something had definitely been there standing on that road studying us the way a predator studies which part of the herd to take. And the thought brought a silence that filled my lungs like heavy smoke. And for the next 6 weeks, we tried to bury the unease under routine convoys on different routes, maintenance, paperwork, anything to drown out the memory of that cold wind and the staring figure, but no part of normal ever returned, and Langdon developed a habit of pausing mid-sentence like hearing whispers under the noise of the bass, and Montreux kept a notebook where he listed details and patterns and names of the missing soldiers from the old convoys. 36 names written in careful rows, and beneath them in darker ink, our 4 names waiting as though the notebook itself already knew the ending, and Penrose stopped humming altogether, and most days sat too quietly like someone listening to something the rest of us could not hear, and I pretended duty could distract me, but every quiet moment reminded me of that dark open road, and I could feel the weight of that missing checkpoint pressing into my thoughts. And then April burned into May, and the heat rose hard enough to bake the asphalt, and somewhere beneath that heat something colder lurked in the edges of our days. And finally Montreux approached me in the mess hall with a tray he did not touch and told me he had begun dreaming of the checkpoint, not the empty patch of desert. A real structure, concrete, small flag snapping on a pole, and someone inside waiting for him, as though the checkpoint had always existed in another version of the world. And he said he tried to walk away in the dream, but his boots would not move, and the ground held him like hands gripping his ankles. And before I could answer, he said Langdon had been having the same dream down to the details, waking at 300 hours, convinced he was late for a duty shift that never existed, and the coincidence made the air around us feel thinner. And I asked about Penrose, and Montreux said he had not asked. He had noticed the way Penrose stared at maps too long, as though doubting the printed world. And when we finally confronted Penrose, he said he had not dreamed of the checkpoint, but he had dreamed of the figure on the road watching him from the edge of his bunk room, a blank tall silhouette that vanished every time he blinked. And I told him it was stress, though I did not believe a word of it. And that night, as I lay awake, unable to sleep, staring at the dark shape of my locker, I knew we were not done with that empty place. And at 300 hours, I stepped out into the night air and found Penrose sitting on the steps, rifle across his knees, watching the fence line, as though expecting something to walk out of the shadows. And when he asked if we were haunted, I could not lie and said maybe, because the truth had become impossible to outrun, and he confessed the figure kept appearing in reflections, windows, mirrors, even puddles, and he sensed it watching him each time. And the confession sat inside me like ice, because I had begun seeing something too movement in the corner of my eye, shapes in reflective surfaces gone before I could focus. And I realized that whatever had stood on that road had left its mark on us, and in the following weeks our days grew increasingly strained, as though time itself was pulling tight around us. And then came the day Penrose vanished, and everything we feared finally became real and irrevocable, because whatever had watched us on that road had returned for him, and there would be no pretending anymore that we had escaped anything at all. Night settled over the base like a sheet of cold metal, and even though the heat from the day still clung to the asphalt, I felt chilled in a way that had nothing to do with weather as I walked the perimeter at 300 hours, because sleep had become impossible, and every shadow looked too tall too aware, and that was when I found Penrose sitting on the barracks steps with his rifle resting across his knees and his eyes fixed on the fence line, as though he expected something to emerge from the darkness. And when I sat beside him, he asked if I thought we were haunted, and I wanted to give him the officer answer, the reassuring one, but honesty had become the only thing that felt real anymore, so I told him yes, maybe we were, and he nodded as if he had known that truth already and simply needed to hear it spoken out loud, and he went on to tell me that he kept seeing the figure from the road in reflections, not fully, not clearly, just a tall shape that appeared for an instant in mirrors and windows and polished metal, before vanishing again. But every appearance felt deliberate, like the figure was reminding him. It had not forgotten, and I asked if he had told anyone, and he shook his head saying Talbot had ordered silence, and besides, who would believe a 19-year-old private claiming a faceless giant was stalking him through glass? And his voice cracked slightly, and I realized how young he really was and how heavy the fear had grown inside him, and we sat there in silence, staring into the dark desert where only the wind moved, and even that seemed careful not to disturb anything watching us. And the following weeks crawled forward with an unbearable tension pressed into every hour, as though the air itself expected something to break, and Langdon began carrying a camera everywhere, snapping pictures of roads and skies and corners of buildings, claiming he wanted documentation in case anything happened, though he never said what that anything was, but the fear beneath his words was unmistakable, and Montreux filled entire notebooks with theories and patterns. The names of all 36 missing soldiers from the older convoys, and then beneath those names he wrote ours in a fourth column as though preparing an inevitable list. And when I asked why he had added our names, he only looked at me with tired eyes and said someone should remember even if we vanished like the rest, because the base would erase us just as it had erased them, and his voice held a resignation that felt heavier than grief and Penrose mean. While grew quieter each day, his smile fading, his jokes drying out, until he walked the halls like a shadow of himself, and I could see fear hollowing him from the inside, and I wished I could tell him it would all pass, that the nightmares would stop, that the figure would leave us alone, but none of that felt true, and I could not lie to someone who still looked to me for direction. And as the temperatures climbed through May, the base turned into an oven, but even the brutal heat could not shake the feeling that something cold stood just behind us waiting. And then on a Tuesday morning, the world shifted for the first time in a way we could not ignore, because Penrose disappeared, and the base changed forever in that instant. And I remember I was working under the hood of an HMMWV when Corporal Davis sprinted across the motor pool toward me, shouting that we had a problem. And when I asked what kind, he said Penrose was gone, not missing with gear, not absent without leave, but gone in a way that made no sense, because he had been in the supply room 10 minutes earlier, logged in on the clipboard, but when Davis returned to ask him something, the room was empty, and the rifle Penrose always kept strapped across his back lay on the concrete floor, as though it had slipped from his hand or been placed there carefully by something that no longer needed to hold it. And I ran with Montreux and Langdon close behind, and saw the supply room for myself, door still open, lights still on, clipboard still on the counter, everything undisturbed except for the single weapon lying abandoned like the final breath of a vanished man. And I ordered full search, and base security locked everything down, running drills through every building, every storage unit, every hallway, every fenced corner, and 40 soldiers spent 6 hours combing the facility until sunset washed the base in orange light, and still found nothing, because there was nothing to find. No struggle, no footprints, no tampering, no door forced open, nothing except the absence of one 19-year-old private who had asked me hours before if we were haunted, and I knew without question what had taken him, and that we were next. And that night Talbot called me to his office, his face older, more strained than I had ever seen, and he told me the truth he had withheld from us, that every vanished convoy in the past had made it back to base just like we had, only for the soldiers to disappear one by one over the following months in locked rooms, guarded halls, even in broad daylight. That the disappearances had nothing to do with the highway itself, but with the people who drove it and saw the place where Rachel checkpoint was supposed to be, because once marked, they were taken slowly, methodically, until none remained, and the realization tightened in my chest like barbed wire. And I asked why he had hidden this, and he admitted he hoped the pattern had been broken, hoped we were different, hoped that maybe by ignoring the mark it would ignore us, but now that Penrose was gone, that hope had died, and he warned that based on past patterns we had at most 4 weeks left. And as I Walked back to my quarters. Montreux and Langdon were waiting, pale and shaken, and I told them everything, and the truth hung between us like a noose, and Montreux said we had to go back to the highway because running had not saved Penrose and hiding would not save us either, and though every instinct inside me screamed that returning would destroy us, something deeper insisted that not returning would be worse. And I realized in that moment that whatever had claimed the 36 before us was not done and would not stop until we faced it. And so we agreed that on our next 72-hour path, we would return to Highway 375, not as soldiers under orders, but as men marked by something ancient standing at the edge of the visible world, waiting for the chance to understand what hunted us or died trying. We left at dawn on Friday using a civilian sedan borrowed through a friend of Langdon because Talbot would have locked us down if he knew what we planned, and the sky over Highway 375 looked painfully blue, the kind of blue that feels stretched too thin over something vast and weighty. And we wore no uniforms, carried no rifles, brought only a camera, a GPS, and the desperate belief that facing whatever hunted us might give us even the smallest chance of surviving, and every mile north felt like walking back into the jaws of something patient and unfinished. And none of us spoke for the first hour because there was nothing left to say that fear had not already carved into our bones, and when we finally saw the long straight stretch where the map had marked Rachel checkpoint, the temperature inside the car dropped so fast that frost edged the glass and our breath turned white. And Langdon whispered that we were close, and Montreux read the coordinates aloud, his voice shaky but steady enough to keep us anchored. And when the numbers matched the location exactly, he ordered Langdon to stop, and the moment our feet touched the dirt, I felt the same silent pressure as before, like something towering stood just outside peripheral sight, studying the shape of us, and the desert held its breath with no wind, no sound, no movement from anything alive. And Langdon lifted the camera and snapped photos while Montreux crouched to examine the ground and called us over, and in the hard earth, we saw marks, shallow depressions arranged in a pattern not made by boots, not made by tires, but made by something that stood for a long time unmoving, and inside those shapes, scratched faint but deliberate, were letters spelling RACHEL. As if a structure or a presence had once stood there and had been erased cleanly from the world, leaving only its shadow behind. And I knelt beside the marks and felt the dirt colder than the air above it, as if memory itself lingered in the ground. And before I could speak, the temperature shifted again, this time rising fast so that heat rippled off the asphalt. And that was when the figure appeared 50 feet ahead, exactly where the road bent under the sun, a tall silhouette. Wet, too tall, too thin, too still, wearing something like a uniform from decades past, but stretched wrong across a body that seemed built for a different gravity. And where a face should have been, there was only smooth flesh like clay wiped clean. And it turned toward us, though it had no eyes, and I felt its attention land on us, like weight and instinct screamed at me not to move, not to breathe, not to acknowledge it. Yet the thing began walking forward, slow, deliberate steps that covered more distance than its motion should have allowed, and Langdon raised the camera with trembling hands and snapped a photo, and the flash lit the figure pale for a heartbeat, and it paused, tilting its head like a dog listening to a distant sound, and then continued advancing, closing the distance fast. And I told them to get in the car, and we ran stumbling across the dirt and piling inside as Langdon twisted the key desperately. But the engine refused to turn, and the figure stepped closer, each movement fluid but wrong, like bones bending at angles they should not, and I could see the surface of its skin ripple like something beneath it was shifting. And when its hand pressed against the hood, the metal bent inward under the weight of a touch that carried no visible muscle, and Langdon muttered a prayer and twisted the key again, and this time the engine roared to life, and he slammed the gear into reverse, and the tires screeched across the dirt, and the figure lunged faster than thought but missed by inches as we swung the car around and shot forward. And in the rearview mirror I saw it standing in the road, shrinking as distance grew until it simply vanished like a frame cut from film. And we drove without speaking, not until we reached the edge of town, not until we reached the highway, not until we reached the base, and locked ourselves inside my quarters with the blinds drawn and the photos uploaded, and on the screen we saw it clearly, the figure, tall, faceless, reaching toward the camera, and the sight of it chilled even the room itself, as if the image carried some echo of the thing behind it. And before we could react, the laptop flickered, and the file vanished one folder at a time until only empty space remained, and 3 days later, Montreux disappeared in the middle of mess hall, leaving behind a coffee mug still warm and no sign of where he had gone, and security found nothing, no breach, no struggle, no witnesses. And it happened again 2 nights later when Langdon vanished from his bunk, leaving his boots in perfect alignment at the foot of his bed, the laces still neatly tied, and I knew then that I was the last one left, and the base began rewriting us before we were even gone, removing their names from logs, deleting trance for papers, scrubbing watch lists, until Penrose and Montreux and Langdon became accidents of memory instead of men, and I knew that soon I would follow, because I felt the cold spreading through my room at night and saw faint reflections of a tall shape in the window glass and heard faint breathing behind me when no one was there, and I began writing everything down because someone needed to know the truth before I vanished too. And the truth is simple. Highway 375 holds a place that should not exist, a checkpoint, not in any official record, but etched into the fabric of the land itself. And every 6 years it marks a convoy, and once marked you belong to it. And it will come for you no matter how many miles you run or how many walls you hide behind, because it does not need roads or doors or time to reach you. And if you are reading this, understand that the world contains places that maps do not reveal, and some places erase the people who see them, and I can feel the air freezing behind me now, and the room is dimming. The lights are still on, and something tall stands only inches away, watching, waiting, finishing what it began on that empty highway. And I am going to turn around now, because that is how this ends. You turn, you see, and then the world forgets you existed. Even now the desert still keeps its secrets buried under silence and sand, and maybe the world will never know what really happened on that stretch of Highway 375. But stories like these survive because someone is left to speak them out loud. And if you made it this far, remember that there are places out there that do not want to be found, and some roads take more than they give. So stay sharp, stay curious, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching from just outside the headlights. If you want more stories like this, more hidden operations, more classified horrors, and more truth buried under dust and denial, make sure you hit subscribe, drop a comment on where you are watching from, and join the squad for the next mission, because out here no one survives alone.